Hello everyone, and welcome back to the next installment of our 9.1 raid guides. This is Crzypck from Complexity Limit, and today we're going to show you how to kill the 9 in Sanctum of Domination on Heroic mode. The 9 is a 2-phase encounter. In Phase 1, you'll be fighting 2 bosses, Kira and Signy. When either of the Phase 1 bosses reaches 15%, you'll trigger the beginning of Phase 2, and Skaya will spawn. She has significantly more health than the Phase 1 bosses, and is really the primary boss of the encounter. Before we get into the 2 Phase 1 bosses, let's go through the encounter along mechanics. There are 6 smaller Valkyr that'll each periodically use an ability against you whenever Skaya uses the Call of the Valkyr ability. These do not happen all at once, but instead one at a time throughout the phase. You'll start by getting one, then a bit later have another Valkyr come down, and so on. Let's go into the individual Valkyr mechanics. Agatha's Eternal Blade will create several large gray lines across the platform, with Agatha then flying across each line in succession. Being hit deals massive damage and knocks you back. Dashla's Might impact puts large purple circles on a few players that explode after a few seconds, dealing shadow damage to anyone within the circle. Targeted players just need to move away from people. When Anhilda casts Bright Aegis, she'll drop to the ground and create a giant glowing circle covering a large part of the room and lasting 40 seconds. Any bosses standing in the circle will take 90% less damage, so your tanks will need to move the bosses outside of the circle. Ariadne's Falling Strike creates several small purple soak circles around the room that explode after 8 seconds. Players soaking take mild shadow damage, but any circles that go unsoaked will deal heavy shadow damage to the entire raid. Make sure all of these circles get soaked. Brynja's Mournful Dirge will put small gray circles around several players, dealing ticking damage for 6 seconds. After 6 seconds, the circles explode, dealing damage to anyone within the circle other than the initial target. Pretty simple, just don't stand in someone else's circle. Arthura's Crushing Gaze picks a random player and puts a 10-yard soak circle on them. After 8 seconds, she'll slam into that target, dealing massive frost damage divided by everybody hit. This deals over 100,000 damage total, so you will need 4 or 5 people soaking this to split the damage so people don't just die. Okay, on to the Phase 1 bosses. First and foremost, you'll want to tank them stacked up on top of each other relatively close to the middle of the room. Each one of these bosses has 2 abilities and the special 100 energy ability. Kira casts Unending Strike at the tank, dealing heavy physical damage and increasing the tank's damage taken by 10% per stack. This also deals light AoE damage to the entire raid. However, the damage dealt to the raid is increased based on the tank's number of damage taken debuff stacks. This will force the tanks to swap at 3 or 4 stacks of the debuff. Kira also casts Formless Mass, creating a small blob ad. This blob will cast Siphon Vitality, which leeches health from every player, but it can and should be interrupted. You'll want to nuke down the blob as quickly as possible, and if you have Death Knight, you'll want to use Death Grip on the ad to pull it into the bosses so you can just cleave it down. Signy casts Song of Dissolution, a channeled ability that lasts for 6 seconds. Each tick applies a stack of a 5-second dot to the raid and refreshes the 5-second duration. She'll also cast Soulful Blast at the tank, dealing a chunk of shadow damage. Both of these abilities are interruptible. However, the Song of Dissolution is much more dangerous due to it being raid-wide damage. Your raid should focus on interrupting the song as early as possible, especially if your healers are asking you to ignore it just so they can pad their parses. Do not let your healers parse. Now, as I said a bit ago, both Kira and Signy have a 100 energy ability. These are basically polar opposite abilities. Kira will cast Wings of Rage, sucking everybody towards her for 7 seconds. At the end of the suck, she does a big smash, dealing heavy damage to anybody within 10 yards of her, and stunning them for 6 seconds. Signy, on the other hand, will cast Reverberating Refrain, pushing all players away from her for 7 seconds. After the push ends, she explodes, dealing massive damage to anybody further than 10 yards from her, and also fears anyone hit. So, in summary, Kira casts Wings of Rage, you run away. Signy casts Reverberating Refrain, you run to her. As soon as either Kira or Signy reaches 15% health, Skaya will land and start smacking your raid, marking the beginning of Phase 2. Because of this, your raid should try and get both Kira and Signy to 15% at as close to the same time as possible. As soon as Skaya lands, pop Bloodlust and finish off the Phase 1 bosses. Throughout Phase 2, all 6 of the Valkyr abilities will continue happening. However, Skaya will also periodically cast Word of Recall every minute and 15 seconds, which will cause all Valkyr abilities that you've seen so far to be recast rapidly. This can get really nasty towards the end of the fight, where you have 5 or 6 of these mechanics coming out one after the other. Skaya's first real ability of the phase is the most impactful, Fragments of Destiny. This will put a debuff on 3 random players, dealing ticking frost damage. This damage does not have a duration, but can be dispelled. When that happens, it jumps to the closest available player. If all 3 debuffs are active on a single player at the same time, all of the debuffs will disappear completely, but a puddle of ice will be left on the ground underneath that player. The puddle will deal damage and slow anybody standing in it, so you'll want to drop this near the edge of the room. To combat this, you'll want your raid leader to put a marker down near an edge of the room. Have a single assigned person stand on that marker. Then, have the 3 debuff players make a triangle around the assigned person. Have the healers dispel the 3 debuffs, forcing them all onto the player in the middle that's standing on the marker. This will quickly and efficiently get all 3 of the debuffs onto that person, make them disappear, and give you full control over where that puddle of ice is going to go. On top of that, Skaya does have a few more tricks. Link Essence will link several players together. If one person in the link takes damage, 60% of that amount is shared and split between all other players in the link. Pierce Soul is a big tank smack, dealing heavy damage and applying 10% movement and healing received reduction. Tanks will want to swap at 3 stacks of this. Skaya will also periodically cast Resentment, applying a 12-second dot to the entire raid, taking from mild shadow damage every second. Your healers might want to use a cooldown here to help keep the raid stable through this. Survive all of Skaya's abilities, plus all of the Valkyr abilities coming out, nuke down the boss, and collect your fancy new epics. If you enjoyed this guide, remember to like it and make sure you're subscribed to the channel to catch all of our previews, guides, kill videos, and more. From the team here at Complexity Limit, have a great day, and we'll see you next time.